Hello beautiful people, Zach Dowdy here, and today we're doing another transition tutorial, how to do 3 simple transition tips. Recently I did a backside board side masterclass and you guys commented some suggestions. So that's what we're going to get into today at Santee Skate Park. Super hyped. A lot of different things to skate here. First, I'm going to get warmed up. I haven't been to the skate park in forever. I came here one time in the very early stages of skateboarding. I didn't really know what I was doing. So I'm excited to skate around, get warmed up, and then get into these 3 simple fundamental transition tricks. In my last video on how to do board slides on transition, or rock and rolls on transition for that matter, I asked you guys what trick tips would you like to see. Max Lynn said, can you do frontside or backside disasters? Yoda 1971 said disaster. So there was a lot of disasters, a lot of requests for disasters. So we're gonna get into backside and frontside disaster today. And the other trick that I think we're gonna do is just frontside pivots. We're gonna do backside disasters first, frontside disasters, and then we're gonna get into frontside pivots. The skate park is definitely an older skate park. I got pretty scabbed up just from sliding out a little bit on this rough concrete. It's pretty rough, but that is the first thing and first tip for learning backside and frontside or any really simple transition, is finding the right transition. So this stuff right behind me is super banked, like really banked out. The coping is really big though at the same time. It's nice and thick coping, so that's good for learning disasters on, because it won't be too intimidating because there's not too much zing factor. You're not going to feel like you're going to whip out or splash out. So that is the first tip, is like finding the right transition. This will be good. Also, the thing before we start anything, we're going to do it on noping, which is this stuff over here that has no coping, because that's going to get you more comfortable, more confident with then doing it on coping and then bigger stuff. So let's get into the first tips on how to do backside disaster, then we'll get into frontside disaster. Now, pretty obviously, you should be pretty comfortable with backside and frontside kick turns before trying disasters. It's going to be easier. Some people do just go straight for disaster because they don't know what to do with all their speed, but you want to be comfortable on the transitions, just doing backside and frontside kick turns. Disasters were invented by Dwayne Peters, the master of disasters. So it's supposed to be kind of like a chaotic trick. There's a way to make it controlled, but altogether you can really just go for this type of trick as long as you don't hang up and roll back in. But there is techniques that can help control it. First, we're going to do backside disaster, because I think it will get you in a better habit, enable you to actually kind of learn them more proper. In the long run, it's going to be easy to figure them out on bigger transitions. So the first thing that you really have to think about is this trick is a big thrust. It's a lot in your shoulder. So a lot of this trick is a pre-wind up. You kind of want to wind up before you get into it. When you get more of an angle at the transition, I feel like you can kind of lock your arms up on the top and then swing back in. So it's a little bit easier. You can kind of lock it on the deck, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So when I say locking up, you're kind of crossing up your board like this. Instead of staying like this, when you stay like this, it's kind of like more of a teeter-totting action. You can kind of lock it like this. It helps you kind of move back into the right direction, because a lot of times with backside disaster, common thing is you want to fall back and your shoulders want to keep churning, you want to revert out. But I promise, if you just kind of lock it and stay like this just for a split second, your board is almost pivoting back into the same way that you rolled back up. It's going to be a lot easier. And from there, it's just basically a fake rock out. Now, this is where I put my feet for backside disaster. I think you want that back foot really in that pivot cut, because a lot of this trick is in that scoop factor. Even if you are alling, I think your feet should be in the same position. This is pretty much how I always keep them for backside disaster. Now, as you're rolling up for the backside disaster, you want to pre-twist your shoulders. What I mean by that is like you're kind of winding them up so that you could turn them the opposite direction. And the idea with the scoop and your shoulders being twisted, as you get to the lip, when you start getting to the top, you can kind of lift and churn your shoulders and sort of shove your board into the top, into disaster motion. So it's definitely more of a scoop motion versus an ollie motion. Once you get to the top of the lip, you really want to turn your shoulders and use the top to kind of lift off and turn off, kind of like a curb. It's almost like you're power sliding into the disaster versus ollieing into it. It becomes scoop eventually, but at first what you're gonna learn is almost like it's a power slide, just sort of shifting your body, kind of like a backside power slide into the disaster, lifting it up. And if you wanna keep everything right above, so when you're twisting your shoulders, you kind of want to be like a hawk, almost hovering over your board so that nothing flips or churns or anything like that. You just want to land right onto the deck, nice and twisted, so you can kind of essentially lock in the backside disaster so you're not over rotating it. Once you're in that lock position and you're ready to come out, you basically shift your shoulders back. So once you open it up, you kind of lock them, close them, and then turn them back in, and that will push you back into the transition. Now, once you're in frontside or backside disaster, basically you just want to use the concave of your nose, pressing on your nose and lifting over the coping, or the noping in this case. You can also use a spine, like something like this, to kind of get used to that motion. That's a good thing to kind of warm up, so once you're into the disaster, it's a lot easier to commit to. Now, in my opinion, the main difference with frontside and backside disaster, with frontside, you really have to lift your whole board up. And what I mean by that is like the back of your board has to come all the way over the coping and into disaster. Then you go back in. With backside, it feels easier because your back wheels are closer to that coping, so you're able to lift and get them in. So it's definitely like more of a, I don't want to say like a huck, it's not more of a huck, but there's definitely more of a scoop, more of a factor of getting up and over and onto the coping than backside disaster, where you kind of thrust into it. I also put my back foot closer up on my tail, so I get more tail, more pop, basically. It's less scoop. So that is the big difference too. Putting your back foot, this is how I put my feet basically for the frontside disaster. This is the stance. And we're definitely gonna get like straight into the ollie to disaster. There's a lot of different techniques we're gonna go into it. And there's a lot of different ways to do tricks. And I've covered some tricks before, but I always feel like there's another way to make that video and covering different techniques to do it. But for this one, this is a proper way to do frontside disaster. So I think the main thing that's really gonna help you with this trick is just being able to do frontside 180s on flat. That's really what it is. You're just doing like a frontside 180 on flat, but you happen to be going up onto the transition. And you definitely have to keep your chest really over your board. And what I mean by that is like you're kind of, instead of doing normal flat ground frontside 180, which you can learn first, is the big difference here is like you really have to go over your board and go in front. So you kind of like almost the way you want to get your board more underneath you, and that helps because it's really hard to get the board over the coping sometimes. Like I definitely struggle with it. That's definitely something I'm always telling myself, is like make sure you lift that board all the way over. So with the 180 motion, you definitely want to keep your head in the transition as well. So it's like you kind of like pendulum yourself, like a lot of transition tricks where you just keep your shoulder in, and if you can keep that back leg out with the frontside disaster and then land in it, you're gonna land more centered. It's gonna be easier to roll back in. Something I think is important to remember also when you're doing frontside disasters is a really low up to high kind of trick. Same with backside too. You don't want to go too much at the lip. Unless you're scooping backside disaster, you can scoop it off the lip. But for frontside disaster, you want to try to do it lower and bring it up on top of the deck. So both of these tricks are pretty similar. It's a lot of low to high besides backside disaster. The feeding positions are pretty similar. A lot in the shoulders. You really want to twist those shoulders up, pre-twist them, swing them in, lock them, and then roll back out. And it's basically like a fakie rock once you're in. I will say with both of these tricks, it's definitely, once you get into the disaster part, backside and frontside, you definitely want to be really above the trick. You want to have both your feet kind of spread out so that when you go in, you have that leverage to make it over the coping and staying compressed. Make sure you stay compressed out of it, because a lot of the times what happens with this is, what I see a lot of times is people get locked up on the top and then they have a hard time getting in. But if you can get up onto the top of the disaster by using these different techniques, surely it'll be a lot easier to commit to it. Next thing I want to talk about, a couple of tips on my perspective, is frontside pivot. It's one of the funnest tricks on transition. Such a simple fundamental trick, but depending where you do it and what you do it on, it could be so cool, so fun. You really want to learn frontside kick turns and kind of like pivot at the top of the kick turn. I'm not saying like here pivot and then do a pivot. That's not what I'm not trying to say, hey, you have to know how to do pivots to do pivots, but basically what you're doing as you frontside kick turn, you find that sweet pendulum spot where like gravity's stopping and you're pulling yourself back in but you can kind of like almost pivot yourself and get used to that. And the reason you want to do that is because it's going to get you a lot more comfortable with just the motion of going up and coming back down on transition. You don't want to go too wide for this trick. This trick is definitely one where it is more of a straight up and straight down type of motion. This is just my perspective on how to do it and some different techniques. You can always ask people at your skate park on how they do it. That's the way I would suggest, ask the locals. But one thing I will say with the front side pivot is there's two different kind of ways to do it. You can sit on your tail as you pivot, and that's kind of like a sure way to do it. Maybe more of a beginner step to do it, and then eventually you're just sitting on your truck. And what I mean by sitting up on your tail is like you kind of go up on top of the coping and just lock yourself into position on front side pivot with your tail resting there, so that way you're not too worried about having to actually balance the pivot too much. Definitely want to be riding on the back seat, and what I mean by that is you want your feet to basically, both your front feet to be behind your bolts, in my opinion, and as you get into the pivot, you sort of move your feet over on top of the bolts when you're locking it into that position. And for your back foot, you really want it in that cup concave part of your board. Now, this analogy might sound kind of crazy, but what I think about this trick is like you're kind of doing a pull-up on a monkey bar without using your arms. You kind of have to do your legs, so you kind of like are bending and pushing it up there, and then you're getting up on top of it and then falling back in. So if you kind of think about that and like almost pendulum yourself up onto it. So what I mean by that is you want to pump that transition and try to get your body up on top of the pivot. You don't want to try to just scratch and get it right in front of you, because a lot of times you're going to end up grinding. So you really do want to try to get really on top of your board. The more on top of your board you can get, the safer it's going to be, because the more you're going to pivot and not grind. Now, a technique that has helped me in the past is kind of think of it as an alley-oop. That will help you from grinding or sliding out too much. So if you do an alley-oop motion, which is kind of like you're going to go up backside, but then you end up going front side at the last minute, sort of like a little sideways carve up onto the coping. Sometimes that really helps you, especially because it allows you to twist your arms and get into that locked pivot position. Once you're in the pivot position, it's kind of like a trust fall. You do have to trust a lot of it. What I would say is getting your front wheels down will allow you to kind of assure that you're making it. Hanging up is a factor with this trick. It definitely can be tricky. The one thing I'll say at that is you can kind of push your truck off the coping. And what I mean by that is like almost like power sliding it underneath as you're lifting off at the same time. So it's almost like a backside power slide off the coping. Now it sounds really scary. I'm not saying like you fully have to like slide down the transition to unlock yourself, but if you can think about it that way, it allows you to sort of push off the coping. So instead of just like kind of falling off the coping, think of it as like you're pushing out of the coping a little bit, like you would if you're just stalled on a curb and you're just pushing off of it. Now, for the other technique for frontside pivot that I like doing is just getting right on the center of my truck, the very center of my truck, and trying to just pivot and go back in. That is very much an alley-oop thing. I think it helps a lot to try to think that you're swinging an alley-oop motion, and you're even when you're going back in, it's almost alley-oop motion too, because it allows you to like almost not hang up, like you hit your truck and come back in that way. For some reason or another, I feel like that pivot motion on your truck and just that radius works out really good and allows you to go back in. So I hope these techniques kind of help you. Kind of skimmed a couple different tricks today. Let me know down in the comment section below what tricks I should do next. I'll do some single tricks. Sometimes I like mixing it up. I just want to get a skate session today. So make sure you smash that like button if you enjoy these videos. Subscribe if you're not already. Appreciate all you beautiful subscribers. See you in the next one. Mash.